Chapter 116 to 119. Alright. I called, sweeping in Joffrey's offices with Eamon at my back after ruminating on the northern matter for a couple of days. I have delivered my son for a lesson. Joffrey dropped his quill to the desk with a bemused look. No doubt he had been expecting a surprise drop-in. He was a master at reading my moods, better even than Lena and Laenor, for all I was supposedly closer to the two siblings. Ah, he said. Regarding the north, I assume? Ah, he'd even guessed the topic. I should be creeped out, or flattered maybe, but mostly it was just useful to have someone that could anticipate what I needed. I know about the north, my son protested as he took his seat. I've read about them and their culture and their art. Yes, I have no doubt you have done, I said dryly. But what do you know of Cregan Stark, or even the Starks in general? He opened his mouth, no doubt to lecture me on the research he had done over the course of his lessons with his tutors, and I waved my hand back and forth. He had picked that particular habit up from his aunt and his father and could go on for hours when he was speaking on a topic that interested him. Evidently, our northern neighbors had piqued his fancy. The way he had said culture and art told me exactly what drew him to them. Something told me that under my son's rule, there would likely be a golden age of culture if nothing else. Let's skip to the start of this little mess in particular, rather than starting with the king who knelt. Walton Stark, I said. He was Lord of Winterfell when King Jaehaerys ascended the throne. He was slain in a rebellion by Maegor's former supporters, the ones the king had sent to the wall, my son told me, sounding as if he were reading straight from a book rather than recalling from memory. He was succeeded by his brother, Lord Alaric Stark. And what can you tell me about Lord Alaric? I asked as Joffrey leaned back with an amused expression. I caught his eye and he smiled, his features shining with fondness. Their lessons were not as regular as I liked, but Eamon loved his uncle Joffrey and my spymaster could bring him out of his shell in a way no one else could. Joffrey liked to pretend he was the quiet and dangerous spymaster, the man who could order a death or disappearance without blinking, but that mask could never stay up in the presence of our children. Lord Alaric became lord when his older brother died. He hosted Queen Alysanne and King Jaehaerys when they came north and his daughter was sent south with them after that. He was lord when Queen Alysanne created the new gift. A mistake, if there ever was one, I said. Well done. Why was it a mistake, he asked, I round with curiosity. Because, dear one, the lands that form the new gift have been steadily losing population for years. The Night's Watch, as stalwart as they are, cannot defend the realm and administer the lands Alysanne gave them. They are too few and this long peace has only whittled down their numbers further. The lords that ruled the lands before had no other duties to distract them from it. I would guess that within 100 or so years, the new gift will be as empty as the gift is now. I was cheating, I knew, yet it was the truth all the same. Then we should give it back to the lords, asked Eamon. So they can rule it again? Ah, now there's the problem, I chuckled. Pride will not allow it. Queen Alysanne is a legend and there are those still alive today that met her personally. To so openly reverse one of her decisions would provoke opposition, Joffrey told him. Yet I will find a way, I promised. There had to be some way of utilizing this conflict between nephew and uncle to return the new gift to the lords of the north and strengthen the watch at the same time. There was evil in the north and although it would not strike in my time, or even the time of my grandchildren, it would strike eventually. The wall was not raised so high for nothing, nor was it raised so high for wildlings. It is our duty, Eamon, to ensure it is kept strong and not left to rot. If only to keep the wildlings from causing trouble. What are wildlings like? I would have answered my son's curious question, but Joffrey cleared his throat in the manner that indicated he felt we were straying too far from the topic. I shot him a look. My son needed to learn about Westeros and what threatened it. I vaguely recalled that a king beyond the wall had come to threaten the north during the rule of, now who was it? Daeron II? Mikar? One of the kings of that era, regardless. Perhaps you could summarize the next few Lord Starks, Sir Joffrey? Very well, he replied smoothly, ignoring my ire. You are correct in what events happened during Lord Alaric's reign, Eamon, but you lack the context for them. Alaric was known to have adored his older brother and when there were none left alive who were directly to blame for his death, he shifted his attention to those indirectly responsible. It was King Jaehaerys that had sent so many traitors north and so it was King Jaehaerys' fault in Alaric's mind. This blame festered, with hate for the faceless royals of the south growing worse, until Queen Alysanne came north. But it wasn't the king's fault, not really, said Eamon. Joffrey shrugged. Men are not rational, Eamon, I told him sadly, thinking of Westeros as a whole more than what the dance would make of my family. Love, war, loss and heartbreak, such things can make monsters of anyone. Look at the Blackwoods and the Brackens. My son, who had been raised with Jane and Allie, nodded thoughtfully. Something the old king was well aware of. Queen Alysanne came alone to the north because preventing that hate from forming into rebellion could not be delayed. It worked, for the most part. Queen Alysanne became the darling of the north, and she did so in a way that even Alaric could not protest at. She wore down his stoic demeanor, she supported the watch, she flew about the north and met the small folk. By becoming loved by his people, Alaric could not move against her or her husband, Joffrey explained. And when Jaehaerys finally came north himself, Alaric could not deny their request to give the lands now known as the new gift to the watch. How does your mother put it? Alysanne was the velvet glove to Jaehaerys' iron fist. Alaric had been shown what would happen if he was loyal, and given a taste of what would happen if he was disloyal. Soft power and hard power, Eamon. Do you remember my lecture on the matter? He nodded furiously. Queen Alysanne stripped the north of land without a single blade at her back. Indeed, said Joffrey. Lord Alaric never forgave them though, even if the north did so happily. When he died in 72 AC, he was succeeded by his grandson, Eddrick Stark. Eddrick was the son of his first son, and although the boy had only just obtained his majority, Eddrick had been taught Alaric's grudge at his mother's teats and was happy to continue it. He was not taught common sense though, he barely ruled for a decade before falling from his horse after a dare. Eamon flushed guilty. Before I had caught on to her games the first time around, Alice had gotten Eamon to carry out a fair share of dares. He had not been as bad as Jocelyn or Lucerys, but it had been annoying to deal with. And then came Ellard. Lord Ellard Stark was the son of Alaric's second son, said Joffrey, retaking the reins of the lecture from me. He succeeded his cousin in 81 AC and, like Eddrick, resented House Targaryen for Walton's death. He summoned his Aunt Alara home from her place by Queen Alysanne's side and turned down the king's offer to have Benjen, her son, squire with Prince Aemon. He is the Lord Stark we credit with the founding of the Northern Isolationist movement, I told Aemon, and I could almost hear the capital letters in my speech. My poor son looked a little overwhelmed with all the sudden information. If I knew him, he'd likely scramble off to write as much as he could remember down as soon as our little lesson was done. He was the first to actively step away from what the South could offer and focus entirely on the North. Yet even then, the memory of Queen Alysanne's visit was strong amongst the Northmen, said Joffrey. When Prince Baelon died and the Great Council was held to select King Jaehaerys' heir, they voted for your papa in honor of her wish for Grandmama Rhaenys to be queen. And against King Jaehaerys' wishes. That was, in my opinion, their biggest motivator. A reminder that, the North remembers those who have done them wrong. Spite, in other words. Lord Ellard passed away not long after that, also without issue, and Winterfell passed to his cousin, Benjen in 103 AC. Lord Benjen had been born in the south and had long resented the lost opportunities there. He sought to mend the relationship the north had with the south, but he did not make much progress with his stubborn lords, nor did he last long as ruler. He died in 106 AC, leaving Winterfell to Lord Rickon Stark, Joffrey droned on. I remembered the old curmudgeon's face clearly, even after he'd been dead for 5 years. He had never forgiven his brother for going south to fight in Dorne and had taken his refusal to return when commanded to even worse. He had spent his last few years ranting and railing against Lord Barrows, Bernard and me for abandoning the North. He had become a divisive figure by the end, with families like the Flints, Umbers and Boltons rallying to him and the Karstarks, Manderleys and others quietly withdrawing their support in favor of the much more charismatic Bernard, a war hero by that point. Then he died and Bernard's faction had made its move, checking the isolationists' power with Lord Baron Karstark's appointment and luring supporters to their banner with cheap glass and farming techniques. Which brings us to Cregan Stark, said Joffrey, who has recently taken control of Winterfell after accusing his regent of dishonestly using his position to steal coin that rightly belongs to himself as Lord of Winterfell. He has also imprisoned his former regent's sons and placed Carhold under his own stewardship until the matter is resolved. We have concerns that the arrest was politically motivated rather than for justice's sake, I told my son. And that without our intervention, Lord Baron may not be given a fair trial. But, why? Asked Aemon. Do you remember your mother's friend, Lord Bernard? Asked Joffrey. He is Cregan's uncle, and the two disagree on many things. Lord Baron is Bernard's good father. Oh, said Eamon, his eyes lighting up at his realization. So Cregan is warning Bernard that he is in charge. Indeed, I said, smoothing Eamon's hair back from his face. And we hope to ensure Lord Baron does not become a victim of that rivalry. It is not to say that Lord Cregan is entirely in the wrong, said Joffrey. In many people's eyes, Lord Baron is part of a plot against him as they seek to weaken him to push their own vision for the North forward. Also true, I sighed. And that is another problem, for Bernard was able to entangle your papa and I in the matter. With the glass? Asked Eamon. For their gardens? I nodded and he settled back, looking thoughtful. My college had never truly interested him beyond the 2 or 3 scholars that studied architecture. He begged Joffrey to take him to see lectures and begged me to buy their books. Another form of art, I suppose, was my fond thought. What will we do? He asked, finally. Now, that is the question, isn't it? I said. I had a half-thought-out plan in mind. It would all depend on what game Cregan was playing, of course. I intend to prevent Bernard storming north as he no doubt intends to, for a start. Wise, drawled Joffrey. Cregan would have him in the dungeons before he could demand Lord Baron's release. Which is what Lord Cregan wants, breathed my son, his eyes wide. Because his uncle is threatening him. Well reasoned, Joffrey said, barely keeping his proud smile from taking over his entire face as he ruffled Eamon's hair. We shall make a schemer of you yet. We keep Cregan from his true objective with one hand, I told them both. And we offer him a truce with the other. I will send a delegation to Winterfell, one he cannot afford to imprison, to gauge his mood and see what peace can be made between us. And what if he doesn't want peace? Asked Eamon, flattening his hair down anxiously. I grimaced. That was the worst-case scenario. If he did not play nicely now, I would more than likely be facing a green north. Even though he had not spent his full strength to aid Rhaenyra in canon, he'd still been one of her greatest supporters. What would Alicent do with a mind like Cregan's at her back? We'll cross that bridge when we get to it, if we get to it, I murmured, worrying at my lip. Tell me, Joff, what is Forrest doing these days? Forrest Fry was attending on his father at the Twins and would not be back in King's Landing for a week or so, although he should return before Bernard reached us. Thankfully. It gave me some time to relax anyway. Relax being a relative word, given a few days later, I was summoned to my father's quarters. Family dinners may have become less awkward over the years, but I still found myself dreading them. Good evening, Aegon, I said as I rounded the corner, arm in arm with Laenor, to find my sibling staring out the window with a grim look on his face. At the sound of my voice he whirled round, looking as if he might be having some sort of heart attack. When he saw it was me, he pulled a face. Rhaenyra, you know I hate that, he grumbled. The court was keen to point out that both my brother and I frequently became lost in our own thoughts. The only difference was that these days Ser Stefan, Laenor, or one of my ladies were quick to prod me from mine if it became too obvious. Ser Garibald had no such care when it came to my brother. Still, I chuckled in response to his fright before nodding graciously at Ser Stefan's brother-in-arms. Your Grace, Ser Garibald said in reply with a solemn nod. Have you seen Helena? Asked Aegon, peering around me as if I might have hidden her beneath Ser Stefan's cloak. I have not, I replied, and then it hit me and I was forced to smile, despite the way my skin still crawled at the knowledge. Today is the day? He fidgeted with his doublet, black-edged with green dragons. Yes. We cannot put it off any longer, your midwife will arrive soon and Grand Maester Edmund is not, he is not as blind as Melos was. The statement was accompanied by a guilty look at my hand. I clutched at the prosthetic without meaning to and summoned a weak smile. He is certainly better than our last two. It was as neutral as I could get. Grand Maester Edmund was full of platitudes and apologies, ready to restore the Citadel's standing in the eyes of the royal family, or so he said. He had even offered Gerardis his chain back and had been affably understanding when Gerardis had informed him he wouldn't take it back even if the Citadel paid him. And yet it had not taken long to spot their plans trying to infiltrate the college. It had not taken long for Edmund to preach against the Alchemists' Guild every time he could reasonably jam it into conversation. It was never about me when it came to Edmund, to do so openly was a one-way ticket to being sidelined by my father once more, but he damn well wasn't on my side. Aegon seemed not to have noted my carefully neutral statement and carried on speaking, his eyes flickering back and forth about the corridor. Yes, well, it would be hard to be worse. I thank you for lending us one of your women. Many at court sing their praises. Is it possible to feel disgust and happiness at the same time? His nervousness was adorable, and yet, it was Helena. Brother and sister. They have earned every shred of praise. The 7 know I might have lost Alice had they not been so talented, I said, thinking back to the tank. No pregnancy since had been so difficult. I looked at Laner, who merely looked at me sadly in return. He would welcome another child with joy. As would everyone else in my life, practically. Even my ladies, who bore the full force of my pregnancy moods. I had left Sab and Maria back at the manse with a good meal and my children to entertain theirs. She was very small, he said gravely. Emond has still not forgiven her. And I have not forgiven Emond. He winced at my tone and Laner's grip on my arm tightened as if he could not stop himself. I understand, Rhaenyra, I really do, but do you not think it underhanded? His wide violet eyes met mine and it was almost like looking at a puppy that was trying to understand what it did wrong by chewing on the carpet or something. Underhanded without a doubt, I replied, thinking of Jocelyn's fury and the uncomfortable feeling the idea of Alice being a bully brought. And I have unleashed Lena on her in turn. When Aegon just frowned, Laner chuckled, which made Aegon stare at him in surprise. Laner never much got involved in conversation during these events father liked to hold. Father loathed him and did not bother hiding it, and the feeling was not quite mutual, but it was close. He was also neutral at best when it came to the rest of them. Well, perhaps that was wrong, like me, he adored Helena. Lena and Alice get on like cats and water, said my husband, and Aegon's surprise and confusion drained away to amusement. Do they? Helena had mentioned something to that effect, but I truly did not think it so bad. It is quite simple, I said dryly. Lena believes Alice to be trouble and is happy to ferret out her bad behavior as proof, whilst ignoring her good behavior, and Alice is convinced Lena hates her and is out to get her. Aegon wasn't listening anymore, however, instead he'd stiffened up. We both turned and followed his gaze to find Helena approaching us. She was pale and as nervous as her husband, dressed in a deep purple dress and draped in silver jewelry I just knew had been a gift from Jane. She smiled when she saw us, but it was a weak one. It won't be that bad, sister, I told her. It's Aegon who must worry for his ribs. It startled a chuckle from my brother at least. Then he held out his arm, which Helena took, and we finished the walk to the private dining rooms we were all so painfully familiar with these days. Daeron, Visera, father and Alicent were already there, which was unsurprising. We were all treated to father's usual bear hugs, followed by my own polite but awkward hug with Alicent, an icily correct greeting for Laner, and a much warmer embrace for my siblings. Good evening Daeron, good evening Visera, I said cheerfully. Good evening, Rhaenyra, they chorused back dutifully. They were dressed neatly in their mother's favorite color and both had been sitting quietly before we entered. Father gave them an indulgent smile as they turned to greet Aegon and Helena. In truth, I reflected, I should have made more time for Daeron and Visera. I had made time for Aegon, Helena and Emond, but it had been easier then. Even Helena had discovered how hard it was to play the adoring big sister around the clock. My youngest sister was reserved and quiet. She lacked Darren's more annoying behaviors and was always polite to everyone, but I sensed I did not much figure in her life, even though father had been desperate for her to forge a friendship with the twins. That had gone as well as expected. Visera had been almost baffled by them, scared of Jocelyn's rambunctiousness, and especially of Morgan. It was enough to make me wonder if she even wanted a dragon, as even Tessarion frightened her. I had thought she would get along better with Alice, but it seemed destined not to be. It was Emond who slunk in last, his doublet rumpled and his hair still damp. The look he shot at me made it clear he still resented the loss of Vermithor. I didn't need Joffrey to know he spent most of his time this past month on Dragonback, practicing maneuvers from the manuals and growing ever more familiar with his new mount. How was your day? Asked father as our meals were laid out before us. He was ignoring Emond's sullen silence apparently. Well enough, Jocelyn is coming along well. She will soon have both arms free once more. He smiled at that and dug into his meat pie. And you, father? Bah, Lord Manfred complains to me once more about Lord Royce. I grimaced at the pastry I had just scooped up. Lord Manfred Swan and Lord Royce Karen, the two were more argumentative than Jane and Alysanne, and that was saying something as I once caught the two of them arguing over the color of a damnable dress. It did not reflect well on Barrows that Lord Manfred had brought his complaint to the king, but then again, Lord Royce was his good father. A headache to be sure, I said with sympathy I actually felt. It is still about the title Lord Royce claims, I suppose? Father nodded grimly and washed down his food with a little wine. Yet before he could reply, Aegon piped up. He ought to complain to Lord Barrows, he said as Aemond nodded along with him. It is not the crown's job to interfere with the business of the lords. I have something to say, declared Helena as father dropped his cutlery and opened his mouth to respond. That is, Aegon and I, we are expecting a child. Probably. Truly, breathed father, his eyes wide and Aegon's insubordination forgotten. There were tears in his eyes. He didn't wait for confirmation but surged to his feet, seizing Aegon and hauling him up before drawing him into a bone-crushing hug that had Laenor wincing in sympathy. He had endured his fair share of those when father forgot his dislike in the face of yet another addition to the family. Another niece or nephew, said Aemond, smiling for the first time I had seen since Dragonstone. Congratulations. He had already known, just like I had. Helena smiled at him fondly and thanked him all the same though. Laenor rose to clap Aegon on the back after father finally released him. I might have further congratulated Helena, but Alicent finally recovered from her shock and almost dragged her eldest daughter across the table in her haste to pull her close. Indeed, she ended up spilling wine all over Daeron. I sighed and acquired a napkin to mop him up as Alicent swapped children, leaving Helena to father. My doublet is ruined, he sniffled as I patted him down. You have others, I told him gently, and he glared at me. This is my favorite though. I examined him, the way his hands twisted on the arms of his chair, then how Visera was clutching her dress tight as she watched father twirl Helena around in joy. Ah. Your mother will not mind. I am sure, if you ask, she will take you to have a new one fitted, I told him. He sniffled again and Visera moved closer, as if she were trying to ascertain if I were the cause. What is wrong? Asked Aemond, apparently noticing our little aside. He was staring at the snot flowing from Darren's nose, with not a small amount of disgust. Helena spilled wine on him. It is fine, I told him. When Visera distracted her brother by laying a hand on his shoulder, I leaned over and whispered to him. He fears losing his mother's attention. It was enough for Aemond's eyes to soften, no doubt remembering the days leading to his fostering at Riverrun. He had been afraid then and he had lashed out. Time had taught him his mother still loved him and that nobody had forgotten about him. Daeron, said Aemond, capturing his brother's attention. I need a squire. Darren's violet eyes went round even as Visera frowned, clearly annoyed. Daeron was the brother she was closest to, if he squired for Aemond then she would be short her usual playmate. Perhaps it is best to let Aegon and Helena have their night tonight, I said. And ask father in the morning? But you would take me as a squire? Asked Daeron quietly. Really? Oh, I had done Daeron a disservice by not playing the older sister, hadn't I? I had been here. The others had not, so his loneliness was on me, as was Visera's. How many times had I told myself I should visit more? Really, said Aemond. I did say I would take you. Daeron? What is wrong, sweetling? Evidently, Alicent had just noticed the small crowd around her youngest son. We parted for her to come and fuss at him. She didn't seem to notice the stain when she drew him onto her lap and rocked him back and forth as he sniffled into her shoulder. Aegon and Laenor both gave me the same bemused look and Aemond snorted at the sight. I will tell father in the morning, he murmured finally. I was sitting with Laenor in the drawing room, sipping an excellent vintage from the Reach and dozing, when I had a revelation. I had been thinking about how happy Helena had looked and remembering that feeling of knowing a new life was growing within you. That another one of my children was coming into the world and the joy that brought both me and my husband who had always been saddened we'd officially stopped at Aemon, who had been so overcome at the idea of Emma. Let's have another child. It was worth it to see Laenor choke and spew red wine down his beautiful sea green tunic before staring at me. Truly, he asked, voice faint. You were set against it, even Emma was unplanned. My reasons for being so seemed faint and far away now, fear it would kill me, fear it was merely an avenue for Corlys to exercise what control he could over me, fear the child would be a daughter and I would go through that pain for nothing. I put my wine glass down and sat forward on the couch, taking his hands in mine and meeting his eyes. Perhaps seeing Helena so has changed my mind, yet I find myself unable to recall why I dismissed the option. He swallowed thickly, tongue darting out to wet his lips. You wish for another child, your father and mother as well. The seven know Lena and Joffrey would not object, they would delight in another little one. We had yet to discuss the matter Corlys had raised, too little time and too much to do. Lena reached up and pushed some of the hair that had escaped my braid back from my face and smiled, yet it was sad and I couldn't quite understand why. "You have had entirely too much wine," he told me. "I shall escort you to Lena's side." I remained sitting as he stood, ignoring his offered hand, instead favoring him with an annoyed look. "I am not so drunk that I have lost my wits to wine," I groused. "We are hardly going to make a child now," he said tartly. "So what should it matter if we wait until morning to decide the details?" Oh, he had me there, even if it was because he thought I'd change my mind on the matter without wine and sleep making my head heavy. I accepted his hand and he drew me to my feet. "I thank you for the sentiment," he said. "Truly, I do." I smiled into his chest as he pulled me close. He might be a little weepy himself, yet there was no sign of it when I drew away. "Well then, my loyal knight. Perhaps you should escort me to my lady-in-waiting?" He smiled and dropped his arm around my waist. He need not have bothered, I was as steady on my feet as I usually was. Perhaps pretending to himself that I was sloshed was his way of protecting himself from the inevitable disappointment he thought he'd feel tomorrow when I awoke, having changed my mind about another child. He kissed my cheek as a way of goodnight and I let myself into my rooms to find Lena perched on the bed, absorbed in some sort of tome and not wearing a whole lot, actually. The wound on her torso was healing well though. I was glad to see her sparring had not reopened it, even if the bruises had faded to a sickly yellow and even green in places. "Good book?" I asked and she glanced up, smiling when she saw me. She had her own rooms of course, close to where her children slept, but it was not unusual she slept in mine. She was my lady-in-waiting after all. "Certainly interesting," she said, putting it aside and smiling at me. "How did your meal go?" Helena made her announcement. "Emond is still sulking with me and he intends to take Dayron as his squire." She rose as I moved to look at myself in the mirror, tugging on her shirt as she seemed to realize she'd gotten distracted undressing. Her long fingers were soon relieving me of my jewelry before she worked at the laces of my gown. I could tell she wasn't much interested in the minutiae of my family. She cared about who would be a threat in the future and Emond was high on that list. "And take over his training in writing at the same time, no doubt," said Lena. "He's better than I would have thought he'd be with no teacher and in such a small time frame." "He has father," I said, shrugging off my clothes until I stood in my shift. "And Aegon and Helena." "Your father, forgive me, but he was no great writer and he does not even have a dragon these days." I thought about that as she found a brush and began unbraiding my hair. I do not know if I could write another if Syrax were taken from me. It was like contemplating losing a limb and stitching on a completely different one in its place, one that did not even match my body. "I feel the same. I do not judge your father, Rhaenyra. None could compare to Vhagar in my eyes just as none could compare to Balerion in his," she told me, running the brush through my hair. She had gained some weight this past month, I reflected. She looked far healthier now than she had on her return. "Do you recall the subject of your father's little ambush near a week ago?" I asked in the silence afterwards. She paused in her brushing. "About Driftmark's inheritance?" "I recall, yes," she said. She had apparently seen her father's outburst coming since her mother had confronted me so brazenly. Not that she'd seen fit to mention either to me or her brother, too involved in her studies and her children. Luke and Rena were thrilled at her return and wanted to spend every moment of the day with her. Not that I could begrudge them her time, they had been overjoyed to learn she did not plan another journey anytime soon. Why? I did not miss the look in her eyes, one of cautious hope. I may have reconsidered my stance on babes in the face of Helena's announcement. The brush went down and she almost forcibly swiveled me around, her hands on my shoulders as she peered at me. "That's great news." There were tears in her eyes as she drew me in close, holding me tight. Lena had struggled to conceive Rena and my niece had been premature. Alanis and Gerardis were of the opinion that she was unlikely to get with child again, another contributor to that terrible breakdown. Her reaction to Emma on her return to King's Landing told me all I needed to know about her plans to deal with that. She would live vicariously through my children as well. "Laner thinks I have drunk too much and will change my mind in the morning." She guided me to the bed and I sat down, watching as she flitted about the room with nervous energy, putting out candles and dousing the fire in the grate. "Laner does not like disappointment," she told me, blowing out the last candle and leaving us in darkness. I smiled to myself as I felt her clamber into bed next to me, the way to bed dipped under her weight and how pleasant it was to have her curl into me. "I wish you had not mentioned it. I doubt I shall sleep tonight from excitement." "What a shame," I said and pretended to curl into my pillow, turning my back to her. I heard her choke in indignation and a snicker escaped me. Tease, she muttered. She shifted closer to me under the coverlet. Help me sleep, my princess? Are you attending me tomorrow? I asked, rolling over into her embrace. With Felena, yes. There was an odd tone to her voice, but I did not want to think about Felena Wainwood right now, so I kissed her deeply and she returned it happily. The next morning saw me slowly arrive at consciousness as the birds outside started up their usual loud greeting to the day. I stretched underneath the covers, sighing heavily when my body cracked and popped. I hate that, mumbled Lena from next to me. I really do. I chuckled as she rose, wrapping her robe around herself and shuffling off to tell the maids I was awake and ready for some juice and sliced fruit. We were digging in when a knock on the door disturbed us and Sab slipped in, her customary chain and short sword on display. I paused. Is she ill this time or did she finally come out and say it? I asked, to both of my ladies' obvious amusement. She begged me to swap shifts, said Sab dryly, dropping into one of the chairs by the table. Maria had something to do with the charity, and Sarah never gives up her shift with the kids. And Maris? Lena asked, sounding more curious than upset. Felena had refused to have anything to do with her since her return from her second journey, and despite the many conversations we'd had on the matter, she refused to budge. It wasn't even religious in nature truly. Septon Patriarch dealt with the rumors surrounding my lover by pretending she was not a follower of the Seven and therefore not subject to its rules. Even Maria had come round, letting her son play freely with Luke and Rena and happily gossiping with her old friend. She told her to extract her head from her behind and quit being. Sab trailed off with a glance at me. Well, let's just say Maris had words. I will have words with her myself if she keeps this up, I grumbled, rising from my bed finally and making my way over to where Sab had begun preparing today's dress. I let myself be tended to as my hair was put into its customary braid and my dress was pulled on around me. Where has my husband got himself to? He is with Jocelyn in his office, waiting for his man's arrival, Sab informed me, and I half wondered why he hadn't gone training until understanding dawned. Ah, no doubt my daughter will be thrilled, I said. Feel free to have some time to yourselves whilst I oversee my daughter's checkup. I left them chatting amongst themselves. Lena had hated Sab when I had first invited her into my service. I had been grateful. Sab had saved my life. I could still see her charging my would-be assassins as if it had happened yesterday, actual Dornish assassins this time, courtesy of Walter Will. I wasn't even sure why Lena had felt that way, it just seemed to be hate at first sight. Yet Sab had persisted, especially after she had returned from her exile on Dragonstone. Lena had come round eventually and the two had become close enough, no doubt their shared interest in women had helped. Lena and Jocelyn were exactly where Sab had said they were and I dropped myself into a chair opposite him. Jocelyn was sat on the floor, frowning at her workbook as if it had done her some great insult. My husband looked as if he had not slept, although he greeted me with a pleased enough smile. Does your head hurt you much this morning? He joked as I sat. Not at all, my love. I did tell you my wits were not addled. His eyes widened a little and he glanced at Jocelyn. He needn't have bothered, she was absolutely absorbed in whatever problem she was trying to reason out. Where are the others this morning? Lessons, he breathed. Did you truly mean what you said last night? Now Jocelyn glanced up, her face scrunched up as she tried to parse the meaning of her father's words. Did Mama say something mean? She asked. Lena chuckled. No, little one, she did not. It would only be mean if she did not tell the truth. And I did tell the truth, I said, triumphantly. So it is not mean. That just puzzled Jocelyn more if I read the expression on her face correctly. No doubt trying to figure out what would be mean if it wasn't the truth, but not mean if it was. I had a feeling it was, because the conundrum was more interesting than her homework. Lena just stared at me, shifting in his seat as if he wanted to spring up and dance at the news. I gave him the most earnest smile I could. The one he gave me in response was a little watery. Do you think they'll take the bandages off today? Asked Jocelyn, failing to read the mood. My arm itches all the time. Lena shook himself out of his stupor and gathered her into his arms, ignoring the way she whined in protest at how embarrassing he was being. The sight had me smiling like an idiot again. The removal of Jocelyn's bandages took most of the morning, mostly because my daughter was unable to sit completely still for any length of time. By the end of it all, I was sure that poor Sanderson might weep as she leapt from her chair a sixth time to run and tell her father about something she had remembered. Jocelyn, I said, my tone carrying a warning. She froze, as if she had forgotten she was supposed to remain seated, and trudged back to her chair, the back of her ears turning red in embarrassment. Laner chuckled as Sanderson gave me a grateful smile. "Did you truly mean it?" whispered Laner again, as if he suspected this some cruel trick I was playing on him. "Yes," I whispered back. "But we will discuss it with Joffrey and Lena later. Right now we must focus on our little warrior." "Tonight?" he asked, fingers tapping out a nervous beat on his thigh. "Tonight," I promised, and he smiled at me again, tears threatening to fall. "All done," sighed Sanderson in relief. I watched with amusement as Jocelyn held up her arm and marveled at how pale the skin was. She prodded it experimentally before directing a bright smile at us all. "Thank you," she said, evidently remembering her manners before Laner and I needed to remind her. "Will I be able to play normally now?" "Be careful for a few more weeks, Princess," Sanderson told her, placing the soiled bandages into a bag. "Likely to be burned. If I knew the practices Girardi's beat into all his students. You do not wish to break it once more, do you?" She shook her head very seriously, her features solemn. My firstborn had chafed at the injury. Well, it would serve her right for clambering up things, just because her sister dared her to. The gash above her eye had healed well enough, although she had earned herself a scar. It was not her first, she was like her Aunt Lena that way, she collected them. "Now, little one, I believe it is time for you to rejoin the others." She groaned as I stood up and held out my hand, but took it anyway. It took her a full minute to be distracted once again by her newly freed arm once more. "It's so skinny," she whispered. "And pale." "It has not seen the sun in some time," laughed Laner from behind us. "And it is skinny because you have not used it." "It will be normal again, won't it?" she asked, suddenly concerned. "It won't always be smaller?" "It will go back to normal soon enough," I told her, and the worry in her eyes faded but did not die. "As long as you are gentle with it." "What if it doesn't?" she whispered. "Then, dash." I frowned at her as she cut herself off. "It will, I promise," I told her. "What is wrong?" She pressed her lips together in a manner that told me I was unlikely to get an answer from her. I sighed and caught Laner's eye. He looked just as helplessly confused as I was by the matter. She was clearly worrying about something. "I will not force it from you," I told her, as her violet eyes met my own. "But if you ever want to talk to me about anything, even if you think it is silly, I will always have time for you. So will your father." "Thank you, Mama, thank you, Papa," she mumbled before tugging insistently on my hand. "We have lessons." "Ah, our little one is eager all of a sudden," japed Laner as we began walking again. It had unsettled him as well, this strange behavior from her. Perhaps it might be worth asking Lena, although the thought made my heart ache with the knowledge she might know my children better than I did. It turned out we needn't have hurried Jocelyn along anyway, for when we opened the door to the room the children took their lessons in, they were enjoying a snack break. I marveled at how it changed, from a dining room that was considered small by the manse's standards to a brightly lit and even more brightly decorated classroom. When Corliss had bought the manse, most of it had not been in use. It was huge, ridiculously so, even for a building close to the Red Keep. I had been told, and I could believe it, that it had been some lord's prestige project back when J. Harry's had been young. Perhaps that explained why Corliss had bought it all those years ago. Yet I could not deny how useful it had been in keeping me out of the Red Keep. Most manses could boast 10, perhaps 12, bedrooms, with a fair few of those being for the use of live-in staff. We did not have much live-in staff here, not anymore. We needed the space. There were 16 of us, all that needed their own rooms. The manse may have about 20 bedrooms, but all of them were full, and only a vanishingly small amount of that space was staff space. It was costing a fortune in the housing benefit we gave to those who should have a room here, but didn't. There had been no argument about moving to the keep though. Even a decade later I still could not do it. Still, there might be something in buying out the next door neighbors. "You're doing it again," chuckled Laner, poking me in the ribs. I jabbed him back and forced myself to focus on the children now that they had greeted Jocelyn, thoroughly examined her wrist, and then gone back to whatever they had been doing before our entry. "My apologies," I said dryly. "I'll try to keep myself as thoughtless as possible." "Would that please you, husband?" That made him snicker. I turned my attention to the children. Aleandra was regaling Jane and Emma with some tale from Dorne's past. Alisanne and Jocelyn appeared to have gotten into an intense discussion about bows and swords, a discussion Rolf was occasionally interjecting in, weighing in on Jocelyn's side. That did not surprise me, he had talent with the blade and Jocelyn was a frequent sparring partner. Alyssa was watching them bicker, amused. She'd thrown her arms around Jocelyn's neck and begged for forgiveness once again, which Jocelyn had stoically granted before collapsing into giggles. Eamon was curled up with a book on art he'd likely liberated from the Keep library last time he had been set loose in there. I blinked as I realized what I had mistaken for a blanket over his knees was the damn cat, taking advantage of the only still child he could find. I met his green eyes with an unblinking stare. "Really?" snorted Laner. "It's a cat, Renera. It's evil," I told him, memories of scratches and bites making my arms tingle. I regretted getting them that cat so much. He loved the children, but he hated me. "Where are Luke and Rena anyway?" "With Joff," he said cheerfully. "His father is in town." "Ah," I said. It did not surprise me that I had not been told. Hells, I doubted Lena knew in truth. Joffrey was touchy when it came to his family. Lord Giles was proud of his son, but I know it still stung the Lonmouth Lord that he had not risen so high with his own family name, but the Valerian one. It also did not help matters that Lord Giles had come to hate Lena. He had pushed for Joffrey to annul the marriage after she had fled in the aftermath of Rena's birth. Something Joffrey had only admitted at the hour of the bat after Rena had been screaming for most of the night. He had been tired and upset, the only reason he had even allowed himself to rant and rave about Lena in the way he did. He had apologized for it later, in typical Joffrey fashion. What I did know for certain, however, was that Lord Giles believed Lucerys to be his grandson, believing Joffrey had gotten Lena with him after their respective childhood crushes had gotten out of hand. Luke and Rena were fond of their father's father. I had been told Lord Giles was given to spoiling them both sweetmeats and presents that had Lena huffing with equal parts annoyance and laughter when they returned from a visit. "No doubt he will be thrilled at your decision," said Laner. I smirked. I knew he'd be unable to contain himself for long. "I did not tell him last night." I told Lena. "So it appears Joff will be the last to know." And he would likely sulk about being so too, although he would understand why Laner had not brought the matter up. "He hates being the last to know anything these days," said Laner dryly. I pushed myself off of the door frame and shut the door to the classroom gently, bidding goodbye to them all with a wave. "Do you miss your night of kisses?" I asked, as we ambled off. "The way he was before Kristen?" "Of course," he exclaimed. "Joff was, you did not really know him then. He wore his heart on his sleeve, he was honest and warm. He threatened to duel me for your honor," I teased, and Laner smiled, before sighing again. "I wish he could regain some of that openness, Renera. Now he hides it all away from me." And Laner hated that because it was partly leftover from the days Joffrey had felt he needed physical distance from Laner, and a decade had not healed that, just as it had not healed his leg. "He hides it from everyone," I pointed out. "Then he weeps about it when it all becomes too much." To Lena, he groused. "Or you. Only because we were convenient and because he loves you too much to want to burden you with such things." "I would gladly bear those burdens 1,000 times over," protested Laner. "Have you told him this?" I asked, and he blushed red. "He is adept at ensuring I never get the chance," he grumbled over my snickers. "I am not saying I want the man he was back, I love the man he has become, I just wish dash." He trailed off, waving his hands about, and I sighed. I understood, even if Laner was not able to put his desires into words. Well, it too eerily mirrored my thoughts on Lena. She had grown so much since Demon, and she had been damaged so much as well. It forged someone I loved with all my heart, and yet part of me wanted to see that carefree ditzy version of her instead of the focused and occasionally grim woman she could be now. "Do you think they talk of us like this?" asked Laner suddenly. "Complain about our shortcomings more likely," I japed, and he giggled. I could well picture Joffrey and Lena's conversations about us. A sudden flicker of glee ran through me. "Certainly Joffrey and I complain about you to one another." He gaped at me like a fish before I could not restrain my smirk and gave the game away. "Do you get together when Lena and I go riding with Mother?" he asked, struggling to contain his giggles at the thought. A family bonding exercise Rainey's had instituted after Lena's return. Sometimes I wondered what might have happened had Lena returned hale and healthy. Certainly she would not have earned anyone's forgiveness. Least of all Rainey's, who had been a frequent visitor to Dragonstone in the year it had taken me to calm down after her return. It pains me to admit, but had it not been for Rainey's increasingly panicked letters regarding Lena's state, I might not have seen her at all, merely concluding my business with Ser Roga and Marilda and then going on my way. Sometimes. Other times we observe court with a good vintage to savage the different fashions. That got him laughing harder. Huh. Perhaps I should take up a similar practice with Lena, he joked. You should. Your disagreement has gone on for too long. My unexpected firmness ended his laughter. Our disagreement, do you forget what she did to you? To Joffrey? To our children? There was heat there. Do you not think she has paid for it? I asked. No. You say she broke, but I saw Joffrey break too. I saw you break. I saw Mother grieve and rage, and I saw my father, he gave up on her. I winced. I swore I would be civil, Rhaenyra, but I did not swear to clutch her close once more. To accept all she did and forgive her for it. I am not asking you to, I replied. I am asking you to build something new from the wreckage of what you were to each other. He dashed away the tears that threatened, and I caught his wrist with my hand, placing it over my cheek. He swallowed thickly, struggling to hold himself in check. You need not hide it from me, I whispered. Let the mask of perfect prince fall and be my friend and husband in truth. That is not fair, he said. You were the one that forced me to wear it to begin with. As I wear my own. We cannot be who we wish to be. None of us can, Laenor. We should at least bind ourselves to one another. We are the only ones that know, that understand. He stared out of the window, throat bobbing, and features formed into a terrible frown. When he spoke, his voice was rough and raspy. I will speak to her and to Joffrey, he said, removing his hand from my cheek. But I make no promises when it comes to her. All I ask for is that you try. If you want to support me, check out my Patreon at https://www.patreon.com/Kaioshin. I tend to polls that decide important plot stuff in my P at Trian. Many thanks to my awesome patrons. Ben Phillips. Yami Tancho. Harold's Martinsons. If you enjoyed the content, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. I'll be here until next time.